It's been almost a month as of the making of this video that Parasomnia was released, so I've had some time to digest it as a composer and as a lifelong fan of the group. And my overall thoughts can be summarized in one sentence, which is that this album is very Dream Theater. And depending on who you're asking, that is either a very good thing or a bad thing. For me, I can kind of see both sides, and I'll try to cover both sides in this review. Let's start with the bad side. When I say this album is very Dream Theater, I literally mean that there are parts of other Dream Theater songs in these tracks. There's an overwhelming sense of deja vu throughout the album. There are certain motifs, riffs, melodies that sound almost identical to other songs throughout their career. And this band are known for their callbacks from time to time, such as in tracks like The Shattered Fortress, for example, where the callbacks served a purpose. But the quote-unquote callbacks in Parasomnia, for example, the similarity to Repentance at the beginning of Midnight Messiah, the Sacrifice Sons riff at the end of Dead Asleep. These callbacks are largely unintentional, but the band left them in anyway. I believe it was in an interview with Mike Portnoy that he said as they were writing and jamming, if a certain part came up in their writing that sounded similar to an older song, they didn't fight against it. They just went with it. They kind of wanted to go with the flow, and that was how their creative process worked in this particular case. And I just don't understand that. I don't understand why you would leave a certain part in a new song if you noticed that it was glaringly similar to a piece from your older work. Is it not so much more interesting to push against that similarity and tweak that part into something new and interesting? Explore that non-intuitive way of songwriting where you're pushing yourself and pushing the piece into a different shape, and eventually you end up with something that you never thought you could create because you really explored a different avenue rather than one that you're comfortable with. But unfortunately, what's happened here is that the band has settled for this comfort, this little zone where they can just churn out stuff. The first thing that comes to mind, they just churn out the riff, churn out the fill, and because it flows nicely, then therefore that's a good thing. I disagree. If you don't play an instrument or if you're not a musician, it might be hard to understand this, but I'll do my best to explain. Every musician has their own tendency when they play or when they jam out. Music does flow out of you and you explore ideas. Sometimes those ideas are new, sometimes you surprise yourself, but very often you'll settle into this comfortable space that you're used to, either based on your influences or your past music. It could be a predictable chord progression that you've always found easy to build off of. It could be a pattern or a melody that you're particularly fond of. And having this comfort zone is a good thing to get the juices flowing, but it's not so good when you find yourself repeating those patterns again and again in the writing process. It's good to listen to new music, try different things, push yourself. So when I heard Mike Portnoy say that they didn't push themselves in this instance, I found it very frustrating. This band has been performing their past catalog for years and years, show after show after show. Those patterns in their riffs, those rhythms in older songs have been drilled into their head multiple times. And it's really hard to move past that music that has hooked itself in your head. It's a difficult thing, but it's important when writing a new piece of work to make that effort, to be aware. And the most frustrating part for me is that they are aware that these parts sounded similar to previous works, but yet they went ahead and landed on Parasomnia. All that said, to be fair, that particular process makes sense considering that it's the first album with Portnoy back in the band, okay? Since it's his first time back, they kind of want to get the chemistry flowing again. Mike doesn't want to rock the boat too much. Ideally, minimal tension throughout the creative process. So if Petrucci plays a riff that sounds exactly like something from Train of Thought, maybe Portnoy will let that go and pick his battles. And the fact that Mike Portnoy wasn't given a producer's credit on the album is also an indicator of this. I believe it was actually agreed between John Petrucci and Mike Portnoy that John would be the only producer listed. So that's an example of Mike letting go of the reins a bit, easing back into his role in the group. I'm not blaming John Petrucci for all this deja vu specifically. In fact, it was Portnoy himself that acknowledged that they were happy enough to ignore those similarities and keep writing regardless. But what I do hope is that Parasomnia is the album where they got that comfort, that settling back in out of their system, and hopefully the next album will be the one where we get some boundary pushing, some challenges explored by the members musically. Maybe, just maybe, now that they're back into the groove of things and touring again, the next album might just be a hotbed of new ideas. It's possible. Isn't that exciting? If I were a member of Dream Theater, the thought of writing my magnum opus this late into my career, exploring new genres, new ideas, that's a very exciting concept. Realistically, that probably won't happen, but one can only hope. I also want to talk about the vocals on this record. In my initial reaction, and by the way, my initial reaction got blocked. You can find a link to it on my Patreon in the description. I pointed James out as having delivered a standout performance on this album. I thought his conviction and delivery was the best he's done since maybe The Astonishing, so credit him for that. However, the actual vocal writing as a whole on this album was very weak, and it follows a trend of their albums in recent years, where the vocal writing really has taken a backseat, and the focus is all on the instrumentals. This is another thing that the band discussed in interviews, is that they do write the music first and then they focus on the vocals. And that is plain and obvious when I listen to this album, because the vocal writing is so boring. When you always focus on writing the music before the vocal, the end result vocal always ends up sounding either very boring, because you're making it as plain as possible to not clash with the busy instrumental, or it sounds unnatural because you're forcing in these syllables and these breaks and these rhythms to match the instrumental. It's just crazy to me that they've never sat down and made the sincere attempt to write a captivating vocal melody as the foundation for a song, because that is always a really strong starting point, and that could in turn inform really cool instrumental ideas. And I don't mean to completely disregard instrumentals as far as emotion goes, because obviously their discography is full of emotional instrumental moments that hit us in the heart. But when you always deprioritize the vocals and leave them till last, you're missing out on that human element, that catchy element, that really spiritual seed from which a really outstanding song can grow from. For them to never approach their songs in that way is truly horrifying and confusing to me. So what do we have so far? We have an album that references older material so much that it basically comes across as Dream Theater by numbers, meat and potatoes Dream Theater, comfortable, cozy, but nothing new, nothing exciting. And we also have vocal melodies that are fine, they exist, but more as an afterthought. Nothing that you really care to hum or sing along to. Very little catchiness and thought put into the vocals. My next point is the tonal inconsistencies in the album. To be fair, since it's a concept album, that intention went a long way towards all of the tracks feeling quite tonally consistent as far as the runtime goes. As a collection of songs, they go together. I do think this album sounds like a more self-contained piece than some of their previous works, and I think the concept did help somewhat towards that, but I'm referring more to the consistency between the lyrics and the music. These songs are dealing with mostly very dark themes of sleeplessness, mental disturbances. Night Terror, for example, is about night terrors, and for the most part this track is quite tonally consistent with the lyrics, but then the sick instrumental is broken up by this slow, halftime, melodramatic guitar solo that kind of comes out of nowhere, ruins the momentum completely, doesn't sound dark, sounds more hopeful, emotional, totally random to me. A Broken Man is even more egregious for this type of tonal confusion. I'm referring mainly to that honky tonk part, which happens in the middle of a song that's supposed to be about PTSD from fighting in the military. Not only does the song fail to evoke any sort of pain or emotional trauma or sleeplessness in the music, but it also goes so far as to plonk in this jazzy, goofy, not so solo section, suddenly injecting some humor into the mix. Like, what? And I've seen people justify this part by saying, oh, it's supposed to represent how he was like drinking with his buddies and stuff, his comrades, having a good time. But to be honest, I find that to be a bit of a cop-out. Like, is the song about PTSD and sleeplessness, or is it not? We're talking about someone's mental torture here. We're talking about the deaths of his comrades. Even in the lyric video, there's the images of the graveyard. Super dark, super serious. And by including this scene with his previous comrades drinking, having a great time, it totally undercuts all of that and almost glorifies that trauma in a way. It makes the experience of veterans so cartoonish and Hollywood-like. Oh yeah, there's the drinking and having fun, and then there's the death of the comrades. Like, what is the message being communicated here? Yes, you have PTSD, but at least you have some good memories drinking. Like, it doesn't make sense. I think it would have made way more sense, actually, if the whole song were in that honky-tonk section and the lyrics were more about that specific memory, and you could subtly juxtapose that with the trauma. But since this scene comes out of nowhere, and it's competing with the darker music, and it's also competing with this hopeful, uplifting atmosphere in the intro, we're unsure how to feel while listening to this song. But like I said, I do think that whole explanation for that honky-tonk part is a cop-out. What's most likely is they wrote the music in its entirety without knowing at all what the song was about, and then, as they admit themselves, they started working on the vocals and in turn the lyrics. They had this honky-tonk part, they had to explain it somehow, and that's why they included that imagery in the lyric video. Bend the Clock is also another curious case of the music not matching tonally with what the song is about. When I first heard the song, I found it to be quite moving and epic, again, sort of spiritual, like we were going to reach some kind of epiphany or inspiration in the lyrics, but the lyrics are just about how bad and terrifying sleep paralysis is. So once again, just writing music for the sake of music, and then the lyrics are not matching the tone of the music at all. Basically because there has to be vocals and there has to be lyrics, so you just kind of gotta get it done, I guess. A real shame. Okay, so now that I got most of my complaints out of the way, I would actually like to take a little bit of a positive turn and talk about what I think works, what I think they succeeded in doing with this album. First of all, and this kind of goes without saying, but it also bears repeating, they are incredible musicians. And listening to them do what they do, it's always a treat. It's always just so cool. Like, the intricacies in their arrangements, the tightness of the performances. And yes, of course, this is an album. There's been some editing, but we've all seen them live. We all know they can do it live. That's not a concern. What you're hearing on this album is stuff that they can really do. It's virtuosic, it's a spectacle, and that is always fun when you check out a new Dream Theater album. It's always part of the excitement. Even if the core songwriting is weak, we'll always get that treat of some crazy instrumental stuff to enjoy. But what I like about this album is that they actually kept that to a minimum. It wasn't really showboating for the sake of showboating. They were overall quite restrained in the technicality on this album, and they saved it for some special moments, such as the complex piano solo by Jordan in the Shadow Man incident. Very cool, very impactful. I felt like the album built up to that, because there was nothing really earlier in the album that matched that. And I also think this restrained approach helps the album be more accessible to metal fans in general. So if we take this album in a vacuum, and if we pretend like we've never heard of Dream Theater before, we've never checked them out before, and you listen to this album, it's gonna be hella impressive. It is gonna wow you. You're gonna be like, who are these guys? And you know, for their age and everything, like, yeah, it's cool. It's like I said, it's impressive. But it's really only within the context of their larger discography and what we know they are capable of regarding pushing boundaries, levels of creativity, expressiveness, experimentation. It's only when we take all of that into account that this album starts to fall short by quite a bit. I do want to touch on the production also. Now, I'm primarily a composer. I'm not a mixing engineer. I can only talk about production from a subjective point of view and kind of what I've picked up on over the years, but I think you'll probably agree that the production on this album is clean, but it's a bit flat. You can hear the drums clearly, you can hear the guitars clearly. Actually, you can't really hear the bass that much. That might be a criticism I have about the levels, is that John Myung's bass is pretty much lost overall, and the guitars are actually probably a bit too loud. But I'd say the balance is reasonable, and you can make out everything that's going on. But when I say it's flat, I mean like there's no imagination gone into how we can really make things pop. I think like adding bits of reverb, echoes, maybe stacking certain tracks to add more beef to them could have benefited a lot. I'm missing like more atmosphere. I'm missing a greater punch to the instrumental. Does that make sense? Like, why does the mix in Octavarium or Train of Thought sound so juicy to me compared to this mix? Let me know if you're an audio engineer out there what's missing. I wish I could put my finger on it. I'm just speaking again as more of a layman when it comes to that stuff. So in conclusion, I find this album to be overall fine, okay, solid. Kudos to them for creating something that is cohesive, is reasonably appealing to the general public, and I'm perfectly happy for any of you who absolutely love it and are eating it up. But me personally, as a fan, I do find it to be a fairly boring record, mainly because I am hearing Dream Theater by numbers, reused ideas. And again, they were totally aware of that happening, and that's what they intended to put out. You know, good for them, but that's not for me. What I'm interested in is hearing them push themselves, trying new things. And this actually leads me to another point I was thinking about. You guys might have seen like these Drumeo things where like Mike Portnoy will go on and he'll play a song he's unfamiliar with, and Jordan went on and did that too. Jordan played Empire State of Mind by Jay-Z and Alicia Keys. Mike Portnoy played Shake It Off by Taylor Swift. And the idea is that they would create their own parts to these songs. But what I realized in watching those clips is that these guys don't listen to pop music at all. And not even pop music, but new music in general. Mike actually said something along the lines of, I can't make heads or tails of this, when referring to Shake It Off by Taylor Swift, one of the most straightforward poppy songs of the 2010s, right? And it got me thinking, it's like, I don't think that these guys understand that there is some good wisdom in the simplicity of the songwriting of pop music. You know, music theory explains pop music very well. There is an appeal to some repetition, for example, in the vocal melodies. There is an appeal to some dynamic vocal layering. There is a science to how catchiness works and how a vocal melody connects to the audience. So it is a shame that they don't explore contemporary music in that way, and I can totally hear it in their music that some of that contemporary wisdom is totally lost on them. But even at that, I'm not hearing any modern influences in their music as far as metal goes or rock. Once again, hate to belabor the point, but I'm only hearing the Dream Theater influence in their work. I really hope that maybe they'll start listening to some new stuff, get inspired, try stuff out. Innovation in music is still happening, and it's moving at a very quick pace now with how much stuff is being released out there. There's a big pool of ideas out there to draw inspiration from, and I hope we get to see some of those colors in their later work. Again, that's probably not going to happen. But like I said, I can only dream. So tell me what you thought of this album and of my analysis. If you don't know me, my name is Ohakade. I'm the composer for the symphonic metal project Valkata. You can check out our music down below. There's also a link to my full reaction database spreadsheet if you're curious about all of the music I've covered on the channel. And if you want to watch my initial reaction to Parasomnia, it's on Patreon, link to that is down below too. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Thanks so much and take care.